discussed on this podcast are determined by the Justice Coordinating Commission of the Sisters of Providence of St. Mary of the Woods, Indiana. Guest opinions do not necessarily reflect those of the Sisters of Providence. To learn more, go to www.spsmw.org.
Welcome to JUSTUs, where we talk about creating an equitable human community and influencing change. Through shared stories and conversation and inspiration, we will learn how you can make a difference in your community. I'm your host, Providence Associate Jane Fisher. Today's guest, Emma Roberts, is joining us in this shared space to discuss land justice. Motivated by Emma's experiences and insights, let's take action for the common good. If not now, tell me when. Emma, before we begin this topic of land justice, please tell us about yourself and how you ended up on this project.
Hi, I'm Emma. I grew up in Terre Haute, Indiana, and I went to Indiana State University, where I earned my bachelor's degrees in history and anthropology with a minor in museum studies. During my time at ISU, I interned at the Vigo County History Center and was hired on part-time as a collections coordinator, and then I began working part-time for the Sisters of Providence in their archives as an archives clerk in September of 2023. And then I began working on a research project involving local Native American history for a land acknowledgement project for the Sisters of Providence, and I began that in November of 2023.
Thank you. And you know, Emma, that's quite a background. That's interesting. I don't run across many anthropology majors. Mm-hmm. So congratulations to you for taking on that field.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. You know, to begin with here in this discussion of land justice, can you help our listeners understand a few key concepts like terra nullius, or what they call empty land?
Mm-hmm. So beginning in the 15th century was considered the Age of Discovery, which involved a large-scale, quote-unquote, discovery and colonization of the Americas by numerous European nations. And this phenomenon was supported by the idea of the doctrine of discovery, which is the belief that European nations had the right to claim land that was deemed terra nullius, which is Latin for land belonging to no one, because it was not occupied by a Christian nation. Overall, this doctrine was used to justify conquering the lands of non-Christian nations, as well as coercing native peoples into converting to Christianity through various forms of persecution.
And it's amazing how many well-intentioned acts were done during that time.
Mm-hmm.
People who thought they were doing the right thing.
Yes, they definitely thought that they were doing the right thing.
I heard an explanation the other day that this doctrine of discovery was really 3 different letters that were issued from the Vatican. So I can't just go out into a book or a library and look for something called the doctrine of discovery, because that collected piece of paper really doesn't exist. Did you know that?
No, I did not know that.
Yeah. So 3 different letters over many, many years were issued. So that's a quick overview of that. Mm-hmm. Let's help us now understand how we got to the term indigenous people versus using the words Native Americans versus using the words American Indians.
So the term Indian, it's an inaccurate term that originated from the 15th century, and it was during the Age of Discovery, and it happened when Christopher Columbus, mistakenly, he believed that he was traveling to India, and he landed in the Caribbean, and Columbus called the indigenous people of this area Indios, which means person from the Indus Valley, when in reality, they weren't from the Indus Valley because it wasn't India. So has been used since then as a way to describe the indigenous people of Americas and used in a generic way. And I'm not really sure when the term Native American and Indigenous people started becoming more common. But as it came out that Indian isn't the correct term and like where it came from, that's when we started using the terms Native American, Indigenous people, since it is the correct term and the more correct way to refer to the people who first were here in the Americas.
Okay. And also, I've learned that there are Indigenous people all over the world.
Yes, that is definitely more of a blanket term.
And also, here was the other thing I knew. When I started reading this stuff, and sometimes in different readings, different topics, I see the word Indigenous with a capital I, and then I see it with a lowercase I. And then I was like, what is going on here? Well, if we're referring to people, then it's a capital I. And if we're referring to plants and other things, then it's a lowercase I. So those of you who like trivial pieces of information or are stuck on grammar, that's the little rule there. Now, besides these concepts of terra nullius and using the term of Indigenous people, you told me something about the difference of land use between the colonizers and the people who were living on this land. The approach to the use of the land is totally different.
Yeah, so the Indigenous or Native peoples have more of a collective or holistic view of the use of the land, and European or Christian ownership model is more of land, like how to use the land, like what can you get from the land?
Not what the land's going to give you.
Yes.
But what you can take from it.
So an example of this would be during the War of 1812, both Native Americans and whites used roughly the same amount of land for farming, but settlers relied on domesticated animals for meat, whereas the Native Americans depended on hunting for their meat. Because hunters required large territory to satisfy their needs, whites insisted that their own methods of land use were superior, and they would farm the land intensively and did it in a way where they believed that they were improving the soil. And they saw the Native Americans as lazy for roaming the land to hunt. And white settlers were also influenced by the Protestant work ethic, which believed that hunting was a sport and not honest labor. Therefore, they justified the removal of Native Americans from the land because the tribes had failed to use the land as God had intended. They didn't believe that they were using land in a way where they could get all like the resources that they could from it. And
let me just say this. Isn't that superiority attitude that my way is the best way?
When in reality, it obviously wasn't the best way, because look where we are now with all of the climate issues. And when the way like the natives were using the land, they used it to not only like benefit themselves, but they also cared for the land and nurtured the land, and they saw it as like a spiritual thing. And it's just a really interesting comparison between how our culture views land use compared to how the natives viewed land use.
Land then was not a commodity. It was a gift.
Definitely.
The land and the air and the
Yeah, and everyone, all of the natives like collectively owned the land. Like no one specifically owned a piece of land. It belonged to everyone, to all of them.
Wow, that is a certainly shift in thinking.
And there was a really interesting quote on this situation from William Henry Harrison, the governor of Indiana, that when citizens, like white settlers, were wanting the natives removed, he agreed with them, and he demanded to know if, quote, one of the finest portions of the globe, Indiana, is to remain in the state of nature, the haunt of a few wretched savages. Which I just thought, here the natives are stewarding this beautiful land and taking care of it, and we just want to get them out so we can dry the land of its resources.
And yet he's recognizing the value of the land, the beauty of the land. Can we now look at what was going on in this area in 2024, this year, regarding this land? The Providence community is taking land justice to a new level. But before we get into this land justice project with the Sisters of Providence, can you take us back in history to what was happening in this place? And when we know these French-speaking women came to the woods, but we really they didn't know really what was going on before they came here in the early 1800s, when Mother Theodore and her 5 companions settled in what's known as the deep woods of Vigo County.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what was going on.
Yeah, so around 1803 to 1809, within that time period, William Henry Harrison, who was the governor of Indiana, oversaw 11 treaties that transferred some 30 million acres of tribal land to the United States, which is an insane amount.
Yeah.
But in regards to this land specifically that St. Mary of the Woods is on, in 1809, William Henry Harrison, he wanted to obtain more land for colonial settlement. And therefore, in September of 1809, Harrison decided to invite various tribes local to Indiana to a meeting at Fort Wayne, where Harrison proceeded to coerce these tribes into a treaty through promises of peace and annuities and promises that they could hunt on the land. And so the treaty ended up being signed on September 30th of 1809 by Harrison and the native tribe leaders who were present. And it ceded about 2.5 to 3 million acres of land in Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan to the United States government and its settlers. And this land was part of that treaty. And obviously, Harrison only invited select tribes and tribe leaders to this meeting who he knew were willing to sell the land. So when this happened, the tribes who were not present, who were not willing to sell the land, were really upset by it. And one of the people specifically upset by it was Tecumseh, who was the Shawnee tribe leader. And so after he found out that that treaty was signed, he questioned the legitimacy of the treaty, and he did not believe that the tribe leaders who signed it had the authority to sell the land that belongs to all of the native people. And so Tecumseh decided to meet with Harrison at Vincennes and ask Harrison to rescind the treaty. And he gives this really amazing speech. And in this speech, Tecumseh says, "No groups among us have a right to sell, even to one another, and surely not to outsiders who want all and will not do with less. Sell a country. Why not sell the air, the clouds, and the great sea, as well as the earth? Did not the Great Spirit make them all for the use of his children? No groups among us have a right to sell, even to one another, and surely not to outsiders who want all and will not do with less. Sell a country. Why not sell the air, the clouds, and the great sea, as well as the earth? Did not the Great Spirit make them all for the use of his children?" And I just think that quote really encapsulates like this whole situation really well. Like,
yes, it does, because he's even looking into the future, not realizing that all children include us. Okay, the Great Spirit made this for the use of all of his children, and how can you sell something that does not? Yeah.
And also in the treaty, Tecumseh, he refers to Harrison as brother, which I just find really interesting. Like, we are all children of God, and we are all like together supposed to steward this land. And it just really like,
absolutely.
I think he does use the term brother to probably like as an emotional like hit to Harrison to kind of like try to bring people together. But it's just really interesting how he uses that term instead of like a more adversary and dividing term.
Yes.
After the speech, though, Harrison refused to rescind the treaty, and in response to this, Tecumseh began to build a multi-tribal confederacy to prevent U.S. colonial expansion, which he said he would do in this speech if Harrison did not rescind the treaty. And this caused tensions to rise between the Native tribes and the U.S. government. So then on November 7th, 1811, William Henry Harrison and his troops destroyed the Shawnee village, Prophetstown, on Tippecanoe River in response to this, which effectively broke the Treaty of Fort Wayne, which in it they said they would keep peace between them. And this is an example of almost all of the treaties that the U.S. government made with the Native tribes they have broken, and this is just one of those examples. Mm-hmm. Like, I believe there were probably over 500 treaties made, and nearly all of them have been broken since then.
Tecumseh was way ahead of his time as far as...
And I highly recommend listeners to go read that speech because it is very moving, and there's a lot of really good parts in it. In fact, I was reading this history book. I believe it was, the last name of the guy was Condit, and he wrote on like Vigo County history, and he quotes Tecumseh in his work. And this is probably in like the early 1900s when this historian was writing about Vigo County. And he said that like everything Tecumseh is saying in the speech is right. We as white settlers are like destroying this land, and we are totally in the wrong. And it's so interesting that a white male historian in that time period was able to read Tecumseh's speech and like be convinced and recognize that we're in the wrong.
When I read some of this stuff and when I hear you talk, the words "Great Spirit" come out, and Tecumseh understood all of that, and he was educated in a way that settlers at that time and the military and the government at that time were not educated, of course. So take me a little bit now further after Tecumseh and maybe to 1830s.
So also in 1838 occurred the Trail of Death between September to December, and it involved the removal of the Potawatomi and other indigenous people in Indiana. Over 850 Potawatomi people were rounded up and marched at gunpoint from their Indiana homeland, and almost all indigenous people were forcibly relocated away from Indiana by 1850. And I just think that this is really interesting, and it puts things in perspective that while white settlers were starting up this fresh new life on this fresh new plot of land, that the Native Americans were being forced off of that same land that had been theirs and was part of their way of life for thousands of years. And it's just really interesting to see that St. Mary of the Woods, while it was getting its start, this horrible, tragic event was happening to the indigenous peoples of the area.
Yes. And it was all part of the mission of coming to help the people here who were trying to educate their people, their children. So the sisters came on that mission to educate the people that had settled now in Indiana.
And then after this, of course, in 1840, the Thrall's house was deeded to Mother Theodore Guerin for the Sisters of Providence, St. Mary of the Woods. And that is where we get our start to where we are now.
And here we are in 2024, beginning to really appreciate the land that we have and the inheritance of it all. There was, I'm told, a genocide in North America that scholars estimate. Well, go ahead, you talk about that. To me, to read and hear about the word genocide on this continent was eye-opening.
Yeah, I think people, when they hear the term genocide, they think mainly of the Holocaust. And I think that's really all we think about. But genocide, it's happened everywhere at this point. And I think we're at an age now where we can start to recognize that genocide is much more prevalent and much more of a problem, and has been a problem of our history.
As humans.
Yeah.
So they tell us that the pre-Columbian population in North America differed by millions of individuals. So some 900,000 people lived north of the Rio Grande in 1492, and some estimate as many as 18 million.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Emma, your research reveals that the genocide of indigenous people in North America began in the 15th century?
Yeah, so during the Age of Discovery, this new close contact with Europeans exposed the native peoples to new diseases, which resulted in significant native population decrease. And because the native population was so weakened, this made it easier for the colonists to acquire control over both the people and the land. And this was done by forcing the native peoples into treaties to give up their lands and then offering compensation for this through hunting rights, guarantees of peace, and annuities. And then through these processes, the colonists were able to drive the native peoples out of the land by displacement and genocide, which eventually resulted in the establishment of the United States of America.
Wow. Well, you told us about Harrison's treaties. How do these treaties impact us today?
So one of the examples of this is the fishing laws in Washington state, where the Native Americans had reserved fishing rights because that was a huge part of their culture and fish was a huge resource for them. But non-Native interests intruded on that when there became more pressure from these non-Natives and the colonists for the land. And this compelled the territorial government to redraw the reservation boundaries and remove the tribes from land where they had access to rivers. So later state laws actually banned Native Americans from off-reservation fishing sites or from using traditional harvesting methods, which that further separates Native Americans from the fish, which was one of their main food sources. And these sorts of laws have major cultural ramifications for the tribes because much traditional knowledge was tied to fishing for these native tribes, and the diminished access to being able to fish weakened the tribe's vital cultural systems and hastened the process of colonization over Native Americans in the region. So since they didn't have access to rivers where they could fish, they didn't have the ability to teach the young people, like their children, how to fish in these cultural ways. Because they weren't able to do that, that cut those cultural ties.
Well, we certainly know when we think of fishing today, we think of commercial fishing.
Mm-hmm.
And so those treaties made a big difference.
Exactly. Yeah, that's, I think, another example of we do fishing for sport, whereas this was their livelihood, like their resources and like what they lived off of.
Mm-hmm. There are treaties about environmental justice today, how that's impacted the reservation system beginnings.
So in regards to environmental justice issues, energy, resource, and military development on tribal land are some of the most prominent Native American environmental justice issues. The relationship between Native Americans and today's society remains exploitive as non-natives continue attempts to gain access to land, water, minerals, and other raw materials from tribal lands. And native lands have also become targets for dump sites, nuclear and weapons testing facilities, and resource extraction.
Amazing.
Mm-hmm. I just think that's insane that we've given them this piece of land that's supposed to be theirs to use with how they want, and yet we're still trying to break into that and take more and more from them.
What's the next one you want to talk about then?
We can talk about the reservation system, which began in around 1871 when Native Americans were placed in the reservation system, and traditional Native American treaty lands were broken up and they were given to individual Native Americans instead of the tribe itself. And this
now we get ownership,
yes,
right?
Yeah,
we get the European style, the colony style of ownership.
Exactly. And this was done in the hopes of assimilating the Native Americans, which into our government, and then would hopefully exterminate the Native American culture and government as it was. And Native American people's cultural oppression was accomplished through various strategies, including prohibitions against practicing Native religions and speaking Native languages, forced assimilation of Native American children into off-reservation boarding schools. And because of these things that happened, it severed this chain between generations.
So much daily life was not passed on because those children were no longer with their families.
Exactly, yes. And I think that was just
That was a good intention, I think, on the part of the American government and their citizens at the time, thinking they were bringing these people into the new age of living, okay? And now in retrospect, we know.
Yeah, we know better. There really was nothing wrong with the way that they were living. There's nothing wrong with different cultures and different ways of living. And I think sometimes our society thinks that, especially as Americans, we think like our way is the best way, the right way, and everyone else needs to follow our way.
Yeah.
Which is not true.
Well, then we had these Native American tribal courts.
Yes, so those tribal courts were actually set up by agencies of the federal government, and they were set up in a way to where the federal government would assign tribal chiefs as head of those governments, and those would act as like the middleman between the federal government and the actual tribes. But this completely changed the traditional leadership of the tribes and was more of a way of the federal government trying to enlighten the Native Americans with this method of European justice. So, for example, jail time and fines were some of the things imposed on, it was suggested for these tribal courts, like, you should use this. This is our way of doing it.
Yes.
And nowadays, tribal courts are even considered by some to be a white man's institution and anti-ethical to Native American traditions, because that's not how they were originally ran.
Right.
This was a system that they were given, and it was put in place by the U.S. federal government. And in general, the body of Native American law, which emerged in the states, it involves federal tribal relationships rather than state tribal relationships, which I think is important to know, that it's the federal government that is dealing with this, and it's not really like a state issue.
Back to the European form of monarchy, government from the very big top.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Well, then it's interesting to realize to how you brought us to today, that and these tribal courts and the relationship of the federal government to these indigenous people, that Indiana has no federally recognized tribes now. So, but here's a token. In 2016, the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi received 166 acres of South Bend land in trust. And now the Miami Nation of Indians of the state of Indiana are actively pursuing the restoration of their federal recognition. And you and I both know that there's a difference between federal recognition and granting them rights.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
And I think that's great, though, that South Bend is giving the Potawatomi land that they can use.
Yes.
Which is a great step forward.
It is. It is. A little step, but it's a step. Did we talk a little bit about attitudes of superiority, which are present throughout history? And here's a relatively recent one that you might share with us.
Yeah, so if you don't know, Fort Harrison was a fort that was pretty prominent in the history of the War of 1812. And it was actually
here in Indiana.
Yes, it was right here in Terre Haute. In the 1970s, there was a cemetery found on that land, and there was a memorial dedicated. And at the memorial dedication ceremony, there was a speech given by the president of the Vigo County Historical Society. And he made a very interesting comment, and I can read the quote. It says, "These battles in the Wabash Valley at Tippecanoe and Fort Harrison between the white men and the Indians not only determined the supremacy of the white men, but also indicated the boundaries on the north between us and Canada." And I was just very shocked and surprised to read that in a speech in the 1970s. Like, we know that these ideas and these like thought processes were very common, but to hear it out loud from such a prominent figure in the community was just and shocking to me. Yes. Mm-hmm. And it really legitimizes the idea that oppression is further legitimized by the racist assumptions held by white European intruders about their own cultural superiority.
Yeah.
And I just think it's interesting to see how that has continued over time. Like, people genuinely believed that because they were white, they're the superior race.
Mm-hmm. We have to be carefully taught when we're children.
Mm-hmm.
It comes from generations back.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Yeah. Well, so here we are again, talking about St. Mary of the Woods and the lands and the hard work that the sisters are putting in here to educate us. Mm-hmm. And many of us are familiar with something called the land ethic that the sisters adopted in 2012, actually. And it seems like Providence community intends to not only connect and protect and preserve the resources God created, but to recognize and connect also with the original peoples of this land. So, Emma, we've heard about the land acknowledgement and the goals of the Sisters of Providence in that declaration. So, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the plan involves a north entry garden park space, and it's going to feature 4 interpretive signs with the purpose of educating people about the land that St. Mary of the Woods now resides on. And the space will also use native plants for it, like for plants that are native to the area. And the 4 signs will be a timeline covering the history of the land from the glaciers, the Native Americans who resided on this land, the treaties that took this land from the Native Americans, and then finally who owned this land after the Native Americans. And the final sign will also include a land acknowledgement, which, if you don't know, a land acknowledgement is a formal statement recognizing that the land on which we now live, work, and occupy was stolen from the native peoples who were the original stewards of this land. So our goals with this is to acknowledge and recognize we are working on living on stolen land, and we want to educate people on the natives who own this land before us and how it was wrongly taken from them. And we want to build and mend relationships with the natives who own this land, and also open discussion about the atrocities of colonization and everything that has happened in our history, and reconcile with the natives who the land was stolen from. And lastly, we want to counter and rescind the doctrine of discovery.
These sisters are amazing, aren't they? This whole community, I should say, of Providence, which includes people who've been connected to the sisters, were educated by the sisters, Providence Associates, all the volunteers and staff who work here, which would point to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very exciting project that I'm very proud to be part of.
Yeah.
And I think it's a right step forward.
I do too. So we've been talking about the happenings within the state of Indiana, and more specifically, Western Vigo County and the home of the sisters. And we encourage you, our listeners, to learn more about the history of the tribes found in your state. So we're at the point now called our call to action. And if you go to, you might want to write this down, a site called https://native-land.ca. This is a Smithsonian history site. You can learn about your area's native languages, treaties, and cessions, which is the giving up of rights of property or territory. Emma, give us some more call to action.
Yeah, so I think the first thing that you can do is educate yourself. So you can educate yourself on the people who were originally on the land that you are now on, which you can do by looking at this site. And I think it's really important to also read Indigenous literature. You can watch Indigenous film shows and even content creators like on TikTok and Instagram. And you can also reach out to your local historical society, usually county historians. They'll have information on the natives who lived on the land before you or before the community that is there now. And it's always interesting to get in contact with them and learn about that. You can also attend Indigenous events, seminars, and workshops, including a powwow, which could be hosted in your area. I know Terre Haute has had a few over the years. And another thing you could do is support and shop from Indigenous-owned businesses. And you can also volunteer at Indigenous organizations. And another thing that you can do is don't let your friends and family and people around you be racist towards Native people. Call them out when they say something and tell them to stop. Another good way is to steward your own land. Pick a spot of land and take care of it. You can learn and research about the indigenous plants that are indigenous to that area, and you can learn about invasive species and focus on planting the native species and pulling out the invasive ones. And then lastly, you can also donate to fundraisers, charities, and organizations that support Indigenous peoples. Do you have anything?
Great, I do.
Add?
Those are great ideas. Those are great ideas. And keep an eye out for educational opportunities coming out from Sisters of Providence.
Yes, definitely.
You'll definitely see them in announced in your newspapers and in communications from St. Mary of the Woods. Well, this Emma has been so eye-opening, and I almost don't know how to close this, but with your research in anthropology and your background, and how would you feel about closing out with a prayer?
I would love to do that.
All right. There's one called the Cherokee Prayer Blessing, if you would.
I can start it. May the warm winds of heaven blow softly upon your house.
May the Great Spirit bless all who enter there.
May your moccasins make happy tracks in many snows.
And may the rainbow always touch your shoulder. Well, thank you, Emma, for all the research you did on the land here and the history. It inspires us to do our own research for our own hometowns and communities. And thank you, Justice listeners, for sharing this time and space with us today. We hope that you are inspired and have learned from Emma and are ready to join us in the calls to action that she laid out for us. Are you ready now to make a difference in conversations within your community? If not now, tell me when. We hope you've enjoyed this episode and will share it with others. Please leave your comments, reviews, and any suggested topics at spsmw.org/contact. Until next time.